So I just want to elaborate a little bit on the use of the tavern, whether it was the site of the Key Tavern here. Um, this is really where America began. I'm not saying this tavern, but in taverns, because there was no place to meet. What occurred in these dwellings, rural, urban, from 1650 up until 1750, this was a meeting place for courtrooms, for religious affiliations, for Masons, and one of the most important things would have been the militia. So the militia from both sides of the coin. So just suppose here in Woodstown, if the British are controlling Woodstown, then it would be a Loyalist outpost. Or if the colonists were controlling Woodstown. So, and this could go back and forth, month to month, year to year. And you know, it's interesting because the tavern owner at times will get caught. He's there to make a living. If the British are occupying here, he lets the British in. And the possibility, and this is arose, espionage. I mean, would he be getting paid by the Americans to you know, to be a spy essentially? You know, and there's some instances with taverns where we're actually pumping out pamphlets and newspapers in the basement, in the attics. And you know, as the new latest news was seeping out from the British, we may have people down in the basement actually making pamphlets to send out to all the colonists to make them aware of what the British were doing. Up and beyond that, the tavern was the place to get your mail. The mail would come through sometimes once a week, sometimes once a month. You would possibly have a little slot here in the cage bar. Again, pamphlets would come by riders. And it must be remembered that a horse typically goes 8 miles in a day. So taverns began as they began to be sprung up by the Quakers in their ingenious scheme to, you know, for monetary gain is to expand. Every 8 miles you'd see a tavern, right up to Philadelphia, right over to Wilmington, up to New York City. And you could actually change a horse, drop your horse, stay the night. And who was running these taverns? I guess that's the other very interesting question. And it was often probably the better bet to find older women, single women, and more importantly, widows. Quote, individuals, which being women that weren't wanted so much, but yet they had great domestic qualities, and they could run a household, and this was perfectly suited for them back at that time. But as we later elaborated on, women eventually were chased out. They couldn't run a tavern, they couldn't own a tavern, and they couldn't go to a tavern getting into Victorian times. So everything came full circle, unfortunately, but that's sometimes how life goes. And the Quakers, probably around 1700, in Philadelphia, when Philadelphia was actually being really laid out in its phenomenal grid European or English copy pattern, the Quakers propagated taverns all over the city, from the waterfront back to what is Fairmount Park now. And they did a lot of segregating by putting taverns for people that didn't make a lot of money, taverns for people that weren't educated. Quakers actually set up taverns with just prostitutes. So you can go get a drink, you can go upstairs, be with a prostitute, and also with drugs. I mean, there were drugs in the 18th century. So the Quakers were supplying these vices to make money, and to be greed driven. And in the same token, there were spots in Philadelphia that there were extraordinarily high-end taverns with had lavish accommodations for the evening, and wonderful menus and rooms, individual rooms with beds and chambermaids and things of this nature. So taverns of every shape and form sprung up. Benjamin Franklin, by the 1750s, was quite dismayed by what he had seen. I mean, Franklin, the great entrepreneur of the Postal Service, he was very upset the taverns, the way of drunkenness and all these vices were happening to push forward our great young nation. But at the same token, he came back with that this was infancy, this was the place where our military and our political affiliations pushed forward to conquer the British. So Franklin knew that you had to get through these difficult times with these difficult people, the drunks, and et cetera, but the tavern was producing, the nation was born in the tavern. Times and things, military operations were planned and schemed. And if we look down in the Raleigh Tavern in Williamsburg, the Continental Congress, as we know it today, was first put together in the Raleigh Tavern. In a tavern in Philadelphia, Thomas Jefferson wrote the first draft of the Declaration of Independence. So we have a whole series of things the taverns played from its inception. And
Okay, well, you've touched on the answers to a majority of these questions, but I'll give you this one from Samuel. What monumental events of the American Revolution are known to have been planned in taverns?
well, I think we just went over several of them, but I mean, these were a lot of clandestine planning, and again, it depends who's in charge of what city. Flip-flopping with the British and the Americans, and and don't forget that we had a great spy system here in the colonies, and that was really intertwined in the major taverns. Not so much, but it did up in Long Island. It was very important for gaining independence from British. The farmers and their various clandestine ways of communications, and so.
Okay, and Rebecca asks, did the revolutionaries worry about being arrested by the crown when they may have been in these taverns planning or plotting?
I think probably the safest place to be was in a tavern with your quote own kind. I mean, today we see the ultimate in tribalism in our nation today, politically speaking, but I think back then it was probably on the same realm, because I mean, if you were in search of your freedom, then you would huddle in with the fellow colonists, or if you were British, you're trying to take over the colonies, then so your own kind would have been engaged in that tavern, and you would have had lookouts on the outside for anyone who had their ear up to the outside of the dwelling. So yes, it was a huge concern to get caught by the crown, or vice versa, to be a spy. So, but great lengths, but it was probably much safer to be in the tavern and speaking than to be on the outside and speaking on the horse trail somewhere when you don't know who's going which way. And just a shilling, a pence could swing someone hugely, because we were all so poor, and that could swing their attitudes to become a loyalist, a colonist, or a spy. So you had to be very careful. So I think the safest place would have been to be in a tavern at that time, yes.
Thank you, interesting. And Chris asks, were tavern owners, along with some patrons during the Revolutionary period, involved in espionage, which again you touched on, and I know many of us have seen that series Turn, which was about George Washington's spies. Were any of those, you think, in this area?
I don't think I'm sure there was some kind of espionage going on in this area, surely. We only know that, from the group from the British side, from the Loyalists, and from the British, the Crown. John Simcoe was here, and he had landed in Salem in the early morning hours, and had the massacre at Thompson's Bridge, which is Alloway's town, and sailed down in the massacre, the skirmish at Quinton, and then down to the Hancock House massacre. So Simcoe was tied into Setauket and Long Island and the New York scene, and he was double dealing with spies and counter spies and moles at the time. But a funny thing that Franklin said, because Franklin actually had come by to meet Samuel Shivers once on land deals. He met with Caspar Wister in the Samuel Shivers house, and Franklin once quoted, he said, he was asked by a friend while having dinner, are you worried that your valet or your valet is a spy? He said, if he is, I don't care, just as long as he's a good damn valet. And he said, I'm quite aware that they're all spies, and I feed them the information I want to feed them. So it's very interesting.
Very interesting. And Carla is asking, did the Loyalists choose to have their own taverns?
No, I don't think, I think at times they may wanted to have their own taverns in pivotal places, particularly places like in New York City or Philadelphia, when, of course, they were occupying, but otherwise not. I mean, if they're not an occupation, then they can't choose that so well, but, yeah.
True, very good point. Jenna is asking, are there other similar taverns to the Sign of the Key in the area?
I would honestly say no, not taverns. There were discerns called alehouses and taverns. You could just suppose you're in the bucolic land out here in Woodstown area and the Salem area, and you're having a hard financial time. You could apply to the Quakers and buy a license just to sell, say, ale and cider on Saturday and Sunday afternoons. They had all kind of programs you could buy into, so you're not full-time. So you can hence make money out of your house, and you can sell it right off the front stoop. So that would have been considered an alehouse. We have one out here in the Seven Stars. It was really an alehouse. It really wasn't a tavern, and it really had a short run as an alehouse. And well, what we have to watch, and we need to be honest purveyors of history. We have a lot of people that want to make their house feel and their dwellings feel more historic and not. They sex them up. And to the ongoing public today, which is not really historically driven, particularly young people, say under 40, 50 years old, and they're very gullible when they walk into a dwelling like this or some of the other dwellings we're talking about, and they believe that it's real. Many times it's not real. It's been sexed up. It's been faked to look old. And we had a lot of this going on in the 19-teens, 1920s. A lot of books, particularly in the South Jersey, tri-state area region, written about these, quote, historic dwellings. And a lot of them were not that historic at all, but they were sexed up because they were controlled by the people that were writing the books, or they were buddies or friends. And they can put a historic sign, a tavern sign out in front, and it's not true. But this is why we get into trouble we get into in this country at times. So, but anyway, nevertheless, the difference between alehouses and taverns. And my definition would be the tavern would have been a place that you could have spent the night, boarded your horse, had a meal, and had a good drink. And an alehouse was just a stop by to get a drink, and maybe a little container of porridge on the way through or something. Yes, but we want to make reckon. This is the oldest drive-up window in the state of New Jersey. When I arrived here to work on the historic preservation of the Sign of the Key Tavern, this was literally, they had put sheetrock and plaster over this window. So when it was opened up, looking at the timber framing, here is the oldest tavern, and this is told in the John Shivers diaries. I was presented by 12 diaries by John Shivers, not by John Shivers, by the 9th generation from John Shivers. And it is a phenomenal asset in the restoration, conservation, and preservation of this dwelling. It tells me everything we need to know, what was in this dwelling on its opening, in its debut in 1669, and what was in here in 1700. It tells me it wasn't raining, the temperature of the day, how many Windsor chairs, how many tavern tables, how much candles cost in 1691. All this information is conveyed in the John Shivers diaries and the logs. So an invaluable set, and this was put forth by extended family members, so that's really helped us out. And you must also look when a lot of these other taverns are trying to tout themselves as saying they have old drive-up windows. Well, all you need to look at is if the stoop is sitting next to the drive-up window, it can't be an old drive-up window. It was something that was fabricated and put in because the carriage and the horse couldn't get close enough because you got bloody steps there of stone. So that's all you need to know. And this occurred a lot, but again, fabricating history is not good. It's not truthful to our youth, and so some of us try to delineate this.
That is so amazing to have a drive-up window in a tavern, and what an incredible resource to have those diaries. That's wonderful. And John is asking, architecturally speaking, can you explain the construction of early taverns?
Well, the construction of early taverns, such as this one being so early, I mean, we find a few taverns around that could actually be cabins. So the cabins, the dovetail type cabins would have been the first construction. And this is primary construction, meaning from probably 1650 on to 1700, 1690. Primary construction is a certain type of timber framing. So this is a timber frame skeleton put together by mortise and tenon joints, pegs, a few dovetail joints, holding the splay of the walls from expanding and contracting, generally all out of white oak for, again, as we mentioned before, for rot resistance. The taverns would have had a cedar shake roof, hand split. A lot of the cedar would have been coming from the Dennisville, New Jersey area down on Route 47, taking from logs that were submerged for hundreds and maybe thousands of years that were just so petrified they made great use of as shingles on the top. And on the exterior you would have had cedar shake siding. On this particular tavern, the cedar shake, the horizontal board had a 45-degree angle on the top and bottom, so the water tended to run down. They have come over the edge a little bit and then down the next one, cascading down. So these would not have been tongue and groove. These were actually at 45s. So very interesting. You find a few of these houses. There's another one in Woodstown with the same siding, a house, and just a handful in Salem City. So that would have been the siding. You would have had yellow white pine as wide stock for the floors, for the cage bar, yellow white pine. And again, in the period, you would have seen like this dividing wall here would have been not painted, and it would have been well oxidized to medium to dark brown at this point. But somebody, unfortunately, probably in the 1920s and 30s had painted this. And you may take notice, but we probably can't see it with the camera here, that's a very wide wall. It has a secret stairway that goes upstairs. So you would have had the stairway coming through the front door that patrons would have used, and you would have had a secret stairway that the owner or the operator of the tavern could have got up there very quickly if there were any problems going on upstairs in the middle of the night. So, and that would have been monitored quite frequently.
Wonderful.
Because when someone got a reputation that their tavern was quite raucous, it would keep patrons away. So they would try to go that extra 8 miles and travel possibly 16 miles to hit the next tavern, because they're not looking for any issues coming into, after a long day of traveling horseback.
You don't want to get that bad reputation, that's for sure.
No, today or in the past, that's one thing that still holds true.
And our final question of the day, Greg, comes from David, and he asks, how has the tavern been received in the town since its restoration?
I would say mixed blessings. I would say people in the town don't really care about things like this. They're living in another world. Even, again, we're talking about people up into 40 years old. They're living in their little electronic world, and they may like to say, well, there's an old place across the street. But I think today with instantaneous information on the computer and on the phone that, we can be in Venice and be in a gondola going under the Grand Rialto Bridge or something. And, to have something this historic right in their own town, I mean, it's not that it's not received well, but, it's just an everyday thing for most people. And a handful of people really revere it and venerate it and come in and want to take tours through the museum, the house museum, and then the tavern. And I wish more young people could get more involved. We have a house tour here a couple times a year, and bring about 450 to 375 people through. And they come through for different reasons, some to see history, some to see the period furnishings, and the specialization of the museum is clocks. They come to see horology and timekeeping. So that's good. So, but it's an ever demanding battle of education to educate people about what's in their local surroundings. But I must say, I don't spend a lot of time here. I'm on the road a lot. But when I'm here, I see a lot of people come and are photographing the house and call ahead when they see the number outside to come through the house. So I think it draws a lot of people through the Woodstown area to make diversions, to see the oldest tavern in New Jersey, 350 years old as of 2019, and still going strong. And the essence here is to try and, if we don't have all the accoutrements that were in the John Chivers diaries, to acquire them and keep upgrading them, whether it be wooden tavern tables, the chairs, the Windsor type chairs, or the pewters. So it's an ever and that's what's very enjoyable about the upgrades, is to make it as authentic as possible, but never to say that these are the actual pieces that were here, because they're not. So being a purveyor of history, historical materialism is something we promote here, and we invite everyone to give us a call if they want to come through, but just look for those certain times of the year. It's much more feasible for us to come through when the tavern is open. And we have our curator, which he hasn't showed up today. The junior curator, I feel like Sage Franklin has not come to see us today, but I guess he's on a sabbatical. It's still January, and things are not cracking yet. But anyway, thanks so much for the questions.
Well, we'd like to thank you for your time, Greg. You've brought this tavern back to life in an amazing way, and it's an amazing resource for the people of this town to see.
Great, thank you very much.